1600! I finally did it. After 2 years of playing chess, I finally reached 1600, and I did it in a big way. That final game was a game that I played like a 2350 rated player, according to chess.com's game review. I'm going to show you that game, but first I want to share 3 crucial elements of my training program, and I hope that it will help you in your personal chess journey, no matter what your rating goal is. And of course, I will reveal the secret question that is helping me unleash my potential. The 3 crucial elements I'm talking about are openings, puzzles, and game analysis. And when we talk about openings, you have to remember, I started learning chess after watching The Queen's Gambit in late 2020, which meant that I immediately fell in love with consuming chess content on YouTube. And a lot of that early content was all about opening tricks and traps. However, I quickly learned that it's not about memorization, and it's more about learning the basic opening principles, because inevitably, I would forget all my opening prep after move 4 to 6, if I was lucky. So what does this mean? It means controlling the center, developing your pieces, and taking care of king safety. What does that look like in practice? It means controlling these 4 squares, and by extension, maybe even the square around it. And developing your pieces means that you're never moving the same piece twice in the opening or until most of your pieces are developed, unless you have a very good reason to. And third, you want to make sure that your king is castled or at least safe. And an easy trick to determine if your king is safe or not is you can figure out how many of your opponent's pieces are attacking your king versus how many of your pieces are actually defending. You always need to make sure that you have appropriate defense for your king. Next up, we have to talk about puzzles. And I've done so many puzzles, it's insane. You can see my rating has improved drastically over the last 2 years, and I've done over 5,000 rated puzzles. That doesn't even include the 550 puzzle rushes that I've done, where I typically get 30 to 48 puzzles. Which brings me to a total of... It's over 9! In total seriousness, it is at least 10,000 puzzles that I've done. And on top of that, most Sundays, my Discord community and I will do a chess study session where we go through books like Yusupov's Boost Your Chess series. And I'm even going through Silman's complete endgame course so that I can get my endgame strength up there on par with the rest of my game. But why should you do puzzles? It's because it helps with your calculation skills and big tactical exchanges, and it helps with your board vision. So for example, if there are pins on the board, you can understand how to utilize them to the fullest extent. Or if you are being pinned, you understand how much danger there is. And then of course, it also helps with your general thought process. You always think with puzzles, checks, captures, and attacks, and that's how you go about finding candidate moves and then calculating and assessing if they're good moves or not. You have to understand what are your resources, what are your opponent's resources. And puzzles present a perfect opportunity to hone your skill at going through that thought process. And the third element of my training has been to analyze my games. So win or loss, I try to analyze every single rapid game. First, I go through and analyze the game without the engine on, so I can go through different thoughts I had during the game, but then I will turn the engine on and I will check if I missed any key ideas. And this is really helpful because it helps me understand why I'm losing games and where I should focus my attention to in both my training and when I'm playing future games. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time for the moment you've all been waiting for. What is the big question that helped me translate a super GM status of puzzles to an improved rapid rating? Which I know it's not like one-to-one like puzzles to rapid rating, but it was always frustrating to me to see such a big gap because I felt like I was stronger than 1500. The question is, what changed? Why do I do this? Because our brains are lazy. I'm sure you can think of someone in your life that doesn't like to use their brains. I'm not trying to give them any free excuses, but it is human nature. Our brains don't want to work if they don't have to. They're always looking for shortcuts. But when you ask yourself what changed, you are forcing your brain to highlight new information about the chessboard so that you can trigger your brain and reassess the chess position and look for ideas that are available. And that's exactly what I did in this game. You're going to see how I've applied all those 3 different elements of my training and also combined it all with what changed. Here I play e4 and I play the Vienna game. This is an opening that I've been comfortable with. Normally my opponent will either play knight f6 or knight c6, but my opponent plays bishop c5. And again, this is the whole thing about memorization versus just trying to understand the basic opening principles of that specific opening. Here, I don't really know what this is. I'm just going to continue developing my pieces and will probably likely transpose to something that I'm familiar with. And that's exactly what happens. We get to this position where all 4 knights are out, the bishops are on good squares, and we continue on with bishop e3. And why? Because when I take a look at the position, I'm asking myself, okay, what's happening? We're pretty symmetrical, but what's black's best piece? You could argue that it might be this bishop because it's controlling a lot of important squares on my dark squares, and all my pawns are on light squares, so I'm not doing a good job fighting on the dark squares right now. So I figured if I try to trade it off, well, okay, I have doubled E pawns, but actually this E3 pawn is doing a great job controlling some important squares, stopping the knight from coming to D4, which would be a prime square for it usually. And at the same time, maybe in the long term, I can have some ideas of D4. One extra bonus is that the rook can come to F1, or if I castle and the rook comes to F1 that way, then I have a semi-open file and I can apply pressure on that file. But my opponent doesn't accept the trade. Instead, they play bishop b4, and I'm already asking myself, what changed? Well, of course, my knight is pinned, so I need to be wary of that. But also, when I go to unpin my knight, the bishop can always capture, right? And if they capture, then I have doubled c-pawns. Usually, you don't want to damage your pawn structure and have doubled pawns, because in an end game, they could be considered weak. But right now, there's no way to attack it, and actually c3 does a good job, again, supporting that idea of d4 potentially in the future. And this time, the open file is the b file, so maybe at some point, I can flick in rook b1, and it could be an asset, but we might be getting too much into the weeds there. So let's move on. And here, knight e7. And you have to understand, like, why is my opponent moving the bishop twice? Why is my opponent moving the knight twice? These are all things that are causing my opponent to fall behind in development. For the most part, my pieces are off of their starting squares, the rooks are connected, and my king is castled. On the flip side, my opponent has the bishop on c8 still, and the king is in the center of the board. So already there are minute advantages that I'm getting. But you still have to figure out what their plan is. And the plan of rerouting this knight is probably to get to f4. And if I ever want to dislodge it from f4, either I have to make a concession around my king, potentially weakening my king, or I need to trade off the bishop. So instead of doing that, I have this nice prophylactic move, which basically just means like preparing for the future. Knight e2 to stop the knight from coming to f4. And here, my opponent still continues with their plan, and I play knight d2. Computer doesn't love it because it wants me to kick the bishop out and have this bishop become totally useless. But in theory, okay, yes, like the black bishop isn't really doing a whole lot. I have control over the dark squares here, and it's staring at nothing. But now it's staring at something it could trade itself off for. Minute detail, the real point of knight d2 is so I can push f4, and like I said, just get this open f file. After my opponent plays c6, it gives me that exact opportunity to play f4. And that is what I do after my opponent takes, and takes. This whole exchange happens, and it's even material, but what's the story of the board? The story of the board is that my pieces are developed, my rook is quite happy, and my opponent's pieces are sad. This knight can't really go anywhere useful. This bishop can't go anywhere. Like the best option is to trade itself off, and the opponent's king is in the center of the board. So this is all looking great for white. And it's hard for black to actually find good moves. So what ends up happening is bishop a5. And this one looked like a weird move, and I had to ask myself, again, what changed? Well, what changed, I noticed, is that the b file is a little bit more open or more accessible to the black queen. So my dark squares are weak. Now that I've taken on f4 with the bishop, my bishop is no longer covering these squares, and queen b6 could be a threat to go and fork the b pawn. It actually isn't a great plan, even in this case, to go and take the b pawn, but I just didn't want to deal with any sort of risk of calculation on this side of things. So what I ended up doing was playing king h1 immediately as a prophylactic move. When I told you that story of the board with the king in the middle, you might have thought, well, what about e5? And yes, this is where we analyze our games and we learn from my analysis. When I take into account the story of the board, I am castled, my opponent's king is not, and I have many open lines to attack the king, so let's go ahead and create more. So e5, if you take, bishop takes, and you need to get your king out of the center before I really bulldoze you. So after castles, bishop just takes the knight. You can't take back with the queen because of the rook, and already this is a pretty forcing variation. And look at how unsafe the black king is. It is really feeling the draft. It has castled, but the castle is in ruins. I didn't see this, but this is something to note in the future. Always, always, always think if your opponent's king is in the center and it's difficult to get out, then go and break the center wide open. But okay, king h1. It's not bad. It's not a bad move. It's still a good move because of my previous development. I'm still way ahead in the position. After bishop d7, now fireworks start to fly. Hopefully you're getting into the habit as I explain these moves. You are also asking yourself what changed in this position after bishop d7. And what changed is that the queen is no longer defending the d6 pawn. So I can go ahead and take that. But in my opinion, the two scariest things in chess are one, by the way, in order, one, kids, because they are always severely underrated. They're always sponges, soaking up the language of chess much faster than old geezers like me. Okay, I'm only 28 years old, so I'm not that old, but for chess, I'm already beyond like the prime learning years, right? I'm trying to prove that wrong, of course. Number two, sorry for the long tangent. Number two is taking free pawns. And why is it so scary? Because always when you take free pawns, you have to figure out if there's compensation for it. And in this case, the bishop disconnected the queen, but there's also a nice discovery. Now black can go and take material themselves and also reveal an attack on my bishop. But the trick here is that now that there's no d-pawn, e5 is even more screaming to be played because there's no d-pawn to challenge the e-pawn. So now I just simply play e5, and I ask black, well, you got two pieces hanging. What are you actually going to do here? And after knight g4, we get an evolution. What has evolved? This rook has evolved from a Magikarp in the first position. It can't move anywhere. It literally cannot do anything. It is a useless Magikarp. And now, in this position here, it has transformed into a beautiful Gyarados. It is doing an amazing job applying pressure on the F file, and it has opened up so many resources to our team. And that is why I play bishop takes f7. Now the king is forever just stuck in the middle, and the king hunt commences. And here I was thinking about two different moves. I was thinking about either just taking the bishop right away or playing queen f3. I saw some ghosts with rook f8 just lining up and x-raying my queen, but I forgot that the bishop can just take the rook. Either way, I thought that the most straightforward way to do this was simply take, and this was winning no matter what. My opponent tries to fork my queen and rook. They think that they have the giant fork, but in reality, they just have this tiny little one that I'm not really concerned about. And the reason why I'm not concerned about it is because of queen f3. If you take my rook, then just queen f5, and that is actually checkmate with the beautiful double bishops and this bishop covering the last square as well. That's not what happened. There's another piece that's hanging. My opponent takes my knight on d2, and here there is another resource. It is checkmate in two moves. If you want to try and find it yourself, pause to solve the video. In the meantime, the resource here is not queen f5 because the knight is still protecting, but instead it is a different move with the bishop. Brilliant move, bishop e6 check. The two bishops, again, exerting so much power. If you go back here, it is mate in one. So my opponent tries to take the bishop, willingly accepting the sacrifice. But this completes a beautiful dovetail mate. This is my favorite checkmating pattern. It's common enough where you do get it quite a bit. And it is just absolutely beautiful. Chef's kiss. And with that move, I finally crossed 1600 and I let out the biggest sigh of relief that I've had in a long time. I hope this video helps you in your chess journey, and if you do want to look at more cases of how to punish your opponent's opening mistakes, then go check out this video right here. Happy learning, everyone.